HOA Karen fined me for my flagpole, so I cited a statute that cost her the board. What could a single statute reveal about an HOA fine? And how could a dispute over one flagpole end up costing an HOA Karen her position on the board? Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. We are glad to have you here for another story. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming stories. Your continued support makes these videos possible, and we sincerely appreciate every viewer who spends time with us. Thank you for watching and supporting the channel. Before we get into the story, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Let's begin the story. Take it down within 10 days, or the fines start automatically. Patricia Caldwell said it before she said good morning. I heard the click of her phone camera from my driveway, followed by the soft metallic tap of the halyard against the 20-foot aluminum flagpole I had installed beside my front lawn 3 days earlier. Tap, tap, tap. A light September wind lifted the American flag above us, while Patricia took another photograph. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was 48 years old, worked as an industrial electrical technician, and had spent most of my adult life learning that instructions mattered most when somebody insisted you did not need to read them. Patricia, who everyone called Patty when she was not conducting HOA business, lowered her phone and handed me a white envelope bearing the Brookfield Ridge Homeowners Association logo. Unauthorized exterior structure, she said. The architectural committee never approved this installation. I looked at the pole, then back at her. Before installing it, I had checked the utility locations, measured the setback twice, reviewed the county requirements, and hired a local contractor to set the base properly. What exactly are you fining me for? I asked. The flagpole. The flag or the pole? Her expression tightened slightly. The structure. You installed it without association approval. I opened the envelope. The notice contained photographs, a covenant reference, a removal deadline, and a warning that monetary penalties could follow if I failed to comply. Patricia folded her arms while I read. This is straightforward, Daniel. Submit a removal confirmation before the deadline, and there will not be a problem. And if I do not, then enforcement proceeds. A delivery truck rolled somewhere down the street. Sprinklers whispered across a neighbor's lawn. Above us, the halyard tapped the pole again. I read the cited covenant provision twice. It covered exterior alterations and architectural approval, but something about the notice bothered me. Maybe it was habit. At work, when a machine failed, I never stopped at the warning light. I traced the circuit until I understood why the warning existed. So instead of arguing, I read every line on both sides of the notice. Near the bottom, beneath the enforcement language and above the association contact information, was a sentence printed in smaller type. The restrictions described in the notice were subject to applicable state and federal law. I read it again. Patricia noticed. Is something unclear? Maybe. I reached into my truck, found a pin in the center console, and circled that sentence. What are you doing? Making sure I remember this part. She gave a short sigh. The board has already reviewed the violation. Did the board review the applicable law? The rules are clear. That was not an answer, and we both knew it. Patricia turned toward her silver sport utility vehicle. Before opening the door, she looked back at the flagpole. 10 days, Daniel. Then she drove away. I remained in the driveway with the notice in one hand and the pen in the other. The flag moved quietly overhead, catching the morning light. I was not angry yet. Mostly, I was curious. Patricia had given me a deadline because she believed the most important words on that page were the ones describing the violation. I was beginning to wonder whether the most important words were the ones printed small enough that she expected nobody to notice them. The first fine appeared on my account before breakfast the morning after the deadline expired. $50. Not enough to scare me, but enough to tell me Patricia intended to follow through. I was drinking coffee at the kitchen table when the association portal refreshed and showed the new balance in red. Outside the window, the flag moved gently against a pale October sky, and every few seconds the halyard made that familiar metallic tap against the pole. I printed the account page and placed it beside the violation notice. By then, I had a small stack of letters from Brookfield Ridge, which was nothing unusual. Patricia had been president for nearly 3 years, and during that time I had received reminders about everything from the color of my replacement mailbox to the placement of a driveway light. I usually complied because most requests were reasonable and arguing over minor details was not how I wanted to spend my evenings. When I replaced my backyard shed door, I submitted the paint color. When I installed a new porch fixture, I sent the architectural committee a photograph. Patricia knew that history, which was probably why she expected the flagpole to disappear as soon as money entered the conversation. 2 days later, another certified envelope arrived. The paper tore loudly across my kitchen as I opened it. The association warned that continued noncompliance could result in additional fines and a formal hearing. I carried the letter outside and walked around the installation again. The pole stood 20 feet high, several feet inside my property line, nowhere near overhead utilities, sidewalks, or neighboring driveways. Before construction, I had called the utility marking service and waited for the colored markings. I had checked local setback requirements. The contractor had used a proper foundation and installed the pole vertically with enough clearance that the flag never came close to another property. I had treated the installation the same way I treated electrical equipment at work. Measure first, verify twice, then proceed. Yet the HOA letter spoke as if I had planted a radio tower in the middle of the street. That evening, Patricia called. "Daniel, your account is beginning to accumulate penalties." I saw that. "Then I assume you have scheduled removal." No, there was a pause. "You understand the fines can continue?" "I understand what the board is doing. The architectural rules require approval." I looked through my kitchen window at the pole. "Do those rules allow regulation, Patricia, or do they allow prohibition?" "You installed an unapproved structure." "That is not what I asked." Her voice became cooler. "If you disagree with enforcement, you can request a hearing." "Good. Send me the procedure." She clearly had not expected that answer. The next morning, the hearing instructions appeared in my email. I printed those too. Then I sat at the dining room table with the covenant booklet, the architectural guidelines, and the original notice spread around me. I started reading from page 1. Not scanning. Reading. By midnight, I had marked every reference to exterior structures, flags, architectural control, enforcement authority, and governing law. The language was repetitive until one phrase caught my attention. The association could adopt reasonable restrictions subject to limitations imposed by applicable law. I leaned back and stared at those words. Reasonable restrictions. That sounded different from absolute authority. I opened my laptop and began searching the state legislative website for statutes involving homeowners associations and residential flag displays. 20 minutes later, I found a section that made me stop scrolling. I read it once, then again, slowly. Patricia had spent 2 weeks telling me what Brookfield Ridge could prohibit. The statute was asking a completely different question. What was Brookfield Ridge legally allowed to regulate? The statute was only a few pages long, but I spent nearly an hour reading every sentence because one word kept appearing in places Patricia had never mentioned. Reasonable. The law did not say homeowners could install anything they wanted without limits. It recognized protections involving residential flag displays while still allowing associations to impose reasonable restrictions concerning location, size, safety, and related conditions. That distinction mattered. I printed the statute and laid it beside Brookfield Ridge's architectural rules. Then I made a list the same way I would troubleshoot an electrical control panel at work. Flagpole height, 20 feet. Property setback, compliant with the measurements I had taken. Utility clearance, verified before installation. Foundation, professionally installed. Flag size, ordinary residential dimensions. Location, entirely within my lot. Nothing I found suggested the association had unlimited authority simply because Patricia called the pole an unauthorized structure. But I also knew enough not to turn an internet search into a legal conclusion. The next morning, I called Rebecca Sloan, a land use attorney recommended by a co-worker who had dealt with a property restriction several years earlier. Her office was above a small insurance agency about 15 minutes from Brookfield Ridge. I arrived carrying a folder containing the covenant, architectural guidelines, installation invoice, utility marking confirmation, photographs, violation notices, fine statements, and the statute I had printed. Rebecca listened without interrupting while I explained everything. Then she spent almost 40 minutes reading. "You did something most people do not do," she finally said. "What is that?" "You separated the right to regulate from the power to prohibit." She turned the statute toward me. "That does not automatically mean your installation wins. The association may still enforce reasonable conditions. We need to compare every relevant requirement against what you actually installed. She asked about the pole height, distance from the sidewalk, foundation, lighting, flag dimensions, and whether anything extended across neighboring property. I answered each question and showed her the contractor paperwork. Rebecca made several notes, then opened the Brookfield Ridge Declaration. Near the enforcement section, she found language almost identical to the sentence I had circled on Patricia's notice. Association authority remains subject to applicable governing law. This is important, she said. But do not send Patricia the statute yet. I stared at her. Why not? Because right now we have violation notices, but I want the board's exact legal position in writing. Ask for the hearing. Ask them to identify precisely why they believe removal is required. Do not argue. Do not educate them. Let them answer. That afternoon, I submitted the hearing request. Patricia responded less than 2 hours later. She confirmed the date and added one sentence beneath her signature. Continued fines would remain in effect while the violation existed. Another $50 appeared on my account the following morning. Then another. I printed every entry and added it to the folder. 5 days before the hearing, Patricia stopped beside my driveway while I was checking the flagpole hardware. The halyard tapped softly against the aluminum above us. This is becoming unnecessarily expensive, she said. I agree. Then remove it. Has the board reviewed the statute that applies to residential flag displays? Her eyes narrowed slightly. Our governing documents give us architectural authority. That still was not my question. She looked at the flag, then back at me. Bring whatever argument you have to the hearing. She walked away before I could answer. I watched her cross the street, then looked at the growing stack of fines inside my folder. Rebecca had told me not to reveal the statute yet, and every instinct I had wanted to show Patricia the page immediately. But I was beginning to understand the strategy. We did not need Patricia to disagree with me verbally beside my driveway. We needed the board to commit its interpretation to paper. The letter arrived 2 days before the hearing, and the moment I saw Patricia Caldwell's signature at the bottom, I knew Rebecca had gotten exactly what she wanted. Brookfield Ridge called it a final enforcement determination. According to the board, my flagpole was an unapproved exterior structure. Its continued presence violated the architectural guidelines, and removal was required regardless of whether the installation satisfied local setback or safety requirements. The letter also confirmed that fines would continue until I removed the pole. I read that sentence twice, then drove straight to Rebecca's office after work. She placed the letter beside the statute and slowly traced one paragraph with her finger. This is the position we needed them to commit to, she said. They are not claiming your pole is unsafe. They are not claiming the flag is oversized. They are not identifying a setback problem. They are saying their architectural authority alone gives them the power to require removal. I nodded toward Patricia's signature, and she put it in writing. Exactly. Rebecca spent the next hour organizing our documents in an order that seemed almost too simple. First came the statute. Then the Brookfield Ridge Declaration acknowledging that association authority remains subject to applicable law. After that came my utility verification, contractor invoice, measurements, photographs, and installation specifications. Last came Patricia's enforcement letter. Do not make this personal tomorrow, Rebecca said. Patricia wants the discussion to become about whether you respected the board. We are going to keep it about whether the board respected the limits of its authority. The following evening, I entered the Brookfield Ridge clubhouse carrying one thin folder. The room smelled faintly of coffee and furniture polish. The air conditioner hummed above the folding tables arranged in a rectangle. Patricia sat at the center with a thick binder in front of her. 2 other board members sat beside her, along with the association's attorney, Mark Ellison. Patricia looked at my folder and then at Rebecca. You brought counsel? I brought someone who reads carefully, I said. Patricia did not smile. She began the hearing by displaying photographs of my front yard. One showed the flagpole at sunrise. Another showed the concrete base. A third had apparently been taken from across the street. She read the architectural provision aloud and summarized the accumulated fines. By the time she finished, the amount on my account had reached several $100s. Mr. Mercer was given repeated opportunities to correct the violation, she said. He declined. Rebecca leaned toward me and whispered, "Let her finish." Patricia continued for another 5 minutes, emphasizing board authority, community standards, and enforcement consistency. Then she closed her binder. Mr. Mercer, You may respond. I could hear the air conditioner and the faint ticking of a wall clock behind me. I opened my folder but did not remove the statute. Not yet. I have one question first, I said. Is the board's position that it can require removal of my flagpole solely because I did not receive architectural approval? Patricia answered immediately. Yes. Rebecca looked toward Mark Ellison. And is that the association's final position? Mark hesitated. It lasted only a second, but I noticed. Patricia did too. The board has already determined the violation, she said. Mark turned toward her. Patricia, I would like to review the specific statutory issue before we characterize the association's legal position that broadly. The room changed. Nothing dramatic happened. Nobody raised a voice. But Patricia's hand stopped on top of her binder. Rebecca slowly opened our folder and placed a single printed page on the table between us. I recognized the highlighted section immediately. Patricia stared at it. Mark reached for his glasses. And for the first time since she had photographed my flagpole, Patricia Caldwell did not tell me what the rules said. Mark Ellison read the highlighted paragraph without speaking, and the silence lasted long enough for me to hear the wall clock click through 4 separate seconds. Patricia finally leaned forward. What exactly is that supposed to change? Rebecca kept her voice even. It changes the source of authority we are discussing. She slid a second page beside the statute, this one copied directly from Brookfield Ridge's declaration. Your governing documents recognize that association restrictions remain subject to applicable law. The statute protects qualifying residential flag displays while permitting reasonable restrictions concerning matters such as location, size, and safety. Your final determination does not identify a safety problem, an improper location, or an unreasonable flag dimension. It says architectural approval alone permits the association to demand removal. Patricia opened her binder. Our rules are still our rules. Rebecca nodded. Until a higher authority limits how those rules may be applied. Mark raised one hand before Patricia could respond. I want to see the installation documents. That was my turn. I placed my contractor invoice on the table, followed by the utility verification, property measurements, and photographs showing the poles several feet inside my lot. Each sheet made a soft sound against the polished tabletop. Patricia watched without touching them. Mark reviewed the measurements carefully. 20 feet, he asked. 20 feet, I said. No lighting. None. Any portion crossing the property boundary. No, he studied another photograph. Utility clearance was confirmed before excavation. Yes. Patricia interrupted. None of this changes the fact that he bypassed architectural approval. Mark looked toward her. It may change what remedy the association can lawfully demand. That sentence landed harder than anything Rebecca or I could have said. One board member, a retired accountant named Susan Harper, turned toward Patricia. Were we given this statute before voting on the enforcement letter? Patricia's expression remained controlled. We were given the architectural guidelines. That was not my question, Susan said. I recognized the phrase immediately because I had used it with Patricia twice. Mark requested a 15-minute recess to review the documents. Rebecca and I stepped into the hallway. My account still showed several $100s in fines. The removal order still existed. Nothing had officially changed, yet the certainty behind it had begun to crack. When the door reopened, Mark asked us to return. Patricia sat with both hands resting on her closed binder. Mark spoke first. The association is pausing further monetary penalties while council reviews the statutory issue and the scope of permissible restrictions. Pausing, Rebecca asked. Temporarily. And the existing fines? They remain pending review. It was not a victory. Not yet. Patricia seemed to recover some confidence. So the violation remains open. Mark looked at her before answering. For the moment, I gathered my documents, but Susan stopped us with one final question. Rebecca, when did Mr. Mercer first raise the possibility that state law applied? Rebecca looked at me. Before this hearing, I pulled out the email exchange where I had specifically asked Patricia whether the board had reviewed the statute. Susan read it, then looked toward Patricia. Did we ask counsel about this after Daniel raised it? Patricia hesitated. I believed our existing policy was sufficient. Mark's expression changed almost imperceptibly. He reached for his laptop. I need to review prior correspondence. Rebecca glanced at me, but said nothing. On the drive home, I kept thinking about those words. Prior correspondence. When I pulled into my driveway, The flag was barely moving in the evening air. Tap, tap, tap. I stood beneath the pole and checked my phone. A new email from Rebecca had arrived. It contained only one sentence. Daniel, do not contact Patricia tonight. Mark just asked for every board email concerning flag enforcement from the past 12 months. The email Mark found had been sitting in Brookfield Ridge's records for almost 7 months, and Patricia had received it directly. Rebecca called me the next afternoon while I was standing beside an electrical cabinet at work. Daniel, they found something. Her voice was measured, which told me immediately this mattered. Mark had reviewed the board correspondence and discovered an earlier message from Association Counsel concerning another homeowner's question about displaying an American flag. The attorney had warned Patricia that any enforcement involving residential flag displays required careful review under applicable law before the board imposed a blanket prohibition or demanded removal. The email did not say homeowners could ignore every architectural rule. It said almost exactly what Rebecca had explained to me. The association could enforce reasonable restrictions, but it needed to understand the statutory limits first. When did Patricia receive it? I asked. 7 months before your first notice. I stared at the gray metal cabinet in front of me while the machinery around the shop hummed steadily. So she knew there was a legal issue. She knew there was enough of an issue to require review, Rebecca said. That distinction matters. Do not exaggerate it. That was Rebecca. She never needed the facts to become bigger than they were. The facts were already doing enough damage. Brookfield Ridge scheduled a special board meeting for Thursday evening. When I arrived, the clubhouse felt different from the hearing. Patricia's thick binder was gone. Mark had a laptop open beside several printed emails. Susan Harper sat with a yellow legal pad covered in notes. The third board member, Robert Gaines, barely looked at Patricia when she entered. Mark began by explaining that his review had identified prior legal correspondence relevant to the enforcement decision. Then he placed the email on the table. Patricia read it without changing expression. Susan spoke first. You received this in March? Yes. And when Daniel asked whether state law had been reviewed, why did you not send this back to council? Patricia folded her hands. Because I believed his violation concerned the structure, not the flag display. Mark responded carefully. That distinction should have been referred for legal review before the board demanded removal. Patricia turned toward him. You are saying the association cannot require architectural approval? No. I am saying the remedy must remain consistent with applicable law. Rebecca placed my installation documents beside the email, and Mr. Mercer has already provided evidence addressing the reasonable regulatory concerns available to the association. The room became quiet again. I remembered Patricia standing in my driveway telling me the rules were clear. Now nobody at the table seemed willing to say that. Mark recommended rescinding the existing fines, withdrawing the removal demand, and revising the association policy before future enforcement. Susan made the motion. Robert seconded it. Patricia did not. The vote passed anyway. I watched Susan write something on her legal pad as Mark confirmed that my account would be corrected. Several $100s in penalties disappeared with 3 raised hands. But the meeting did not end. Susan turned to the next item. We also need to discuss how this enforcement reached a final determination after council had already warned us that statutory review was necessary. Patricia sat straighter. That sounds like a separate matter. It is, Susan said. For the first time, I understood that my flagpole dispute had become only one piece of a larger question. Rebecca touched my folder and quietly indicated that our business was finished. We stood and walked toward the door. Behind us, the board members remained seated. As I reached the hallway, I heard Susan ask Mark what procedure governed removal of a board officer from a leadership position. I stopped for half a second. Rebecca kept walking. Come on, she said quietly. Your account is resolved. What happens inside that room now belongs to the board. When I reached home, I opened the association portal. The red balance was gone. It showed $0. Outside, the night wind moved the flag just enough to pull the halyard against the aluminum pole. Tap, tap, tap. The same sound Patricia had heard while photographing my supposed violation. Only now, somewhere inside the clubhouse, her own board was reading the document she should have read months before. By Saturday morning, everyone in Brookfield Ridge seemed to know something had happened inside that clubhouse, but nobody knew exactly what. I learned the answer while carrying a mug of coffee down my driveway. The flag above me caught a steady October breeze, and the halyard tapped softly against the aluminum pole. Tap, tap, tap. My phone vibrated with an association email titled Board Leadership Update. I opened it expecting another policy notice. Instead, the first sentence said Patricia Caldwell was no longer serving as president of the Brookfield Ridge Homeowners Association. She was still a board member pending the remainder of her elected term, but Susan Harper had been appointed president under the board's governing procedure. I read the message twice. There was no celebration in the language, no accusation, no public embarrassment. The notice simply explained that the board had reorganized its officer positions following an internal review of enforcement procedures and legal consultation practices. 10 minutes later, Susan called me. "I wanted you to hear this directly," she said. "Your case exposed a process problem we should have caught earlier." "Was Patricia removed because of my flagpole?" I asked. Susan paused. "Not because you installed a flagpole. Because the board concluded that legal concerns had been raised before enforcement escalated, and those concerns were not properly brought back to the full board." That distinction mattered to me. I had never wanted Patricia punished for disagreeing with me. I wanted the fines removed and the association to stop claiming authority it had not verified. Susan explained that Brookfield Ridge was temporarily suspending similar architectural enforcement involving protected displays until Mark completed revised guidance. Future notices would require legal review whenever state or federal protections might limit association rules. "We also owe you a corrected determination," she said. It arrived by certified mail 4 days later. The envelope looked almost identical to the first one Patricia had handed me, but the language inside could not have been more different. My fines were formally rescinded. The removal demand was withdrawn. My account balance was confirmed at $0. The board acknowledged that its architectural authority had to be applied consistently with governing law and reasonable restrictions. I carried the letter to my dining room table and placed it beside the original notice. Same association logo, same property address, 2 completely different conclusions. Then I noticed the line near the bottom of the original page, still circled in blue ink, subject to applicable state and federal law. The association had printed its own limitation directly beneath its threat. A week later, Patricia stopped near my driveway while I was tightening a small halyard cleat. She was dressed casually instead of carrying her usual binder. For several seconds, she looked up at the flag. "I suppose you are satisfied," she said. "My account is corrected." That is not what I meant. I knew exactly what she meant, but I refused to turn it into something personal. "I did not ask the board to remove you as president, Patricia." She looked at me. "Your attorney forced the issue. The statute forced the issue." The wind shifted, and the flag opened fully above us. "You could have checked it when I asked." Patricia said nothing. Her eyes moved toward the pole, then toward my house. Finally, she gave a small nod and walked away. I watched her disappear around the corner before returning to the cleat. There was no victory speech waiting in my head. There was only the strange relief of knowing the rules had finally been placed back where they belonged. The board could regulate. The board could enforce. But the board was never the highest authority simply because someone sitting at the center of the table believed it was. The new policy arrived at the end of October, printed on 3 pages instead of buried inside another warning letter. I read it at my kitchen table while rain tapped against the windows and coffee cooled beside my elbow. Brookfield Ridge would still require homeowners to submit architectural requests for certain exterior installations, but the revised language now separated ordinary structures from displays protected or limited by applicable law. It established reasonable standards for height, placement, safety, illumination, and property boundaries instead of pretending the board could simply prohibit anything it disliked. My 20-foot pole met every listed condition. Rebecca reviewed the policy and called me that afternoon. "This is what they should have written before they fined you," she said. Then I suppose something useful came out of all those envelopes. More than something useful. They changed the process. I understood what she meant a few days later when I attended the first open meeting under Susan Harper's leadership. I had no dispute left to argue, but I wanted to hear how the board handled questions now. The clubhouse smelled like coffee again. The same air conditioner hummed overhead. The same folding tables formed the same rectangle. What had changed was the way people spoke. Susan opened the meeting by explaining that enforcement decisions involving potentially protected homeowner rights would receive legal review before fines escalated. Mark Ellison summarized the revised procedure without mentioning my case by name. Then homeowners began raising their hands. A retired teacher asked about a small flag bracket attached to her porch. Another resident asked whether a decorative pole near his garage required approval. Instead of declaring immediate violations, Susan said, "We will verify the governing language and respond in writing." I almost smiled. Patricia sat 2 seats away from her. She was still a board member, but there was no thick binder position like a shield in front of her. She listened more than she spoke. When one homeowner complained that the revised process seemed slower, Susan answered, "Accuracy is worth an extra day." That sentence stayed with me. My entire dispute had started because speed and certainty had been treated as substitutes for accuracy. After the meeting, Mark approached me near the door. "Daniel, your corrected account has been finalized." I saw the zero balance. There is also a permanent notation stating that the prior enforcement was rescinded following statutory review. That should prevent the same issue from being reopened without examining the legal determination. Good. He nodded toward the parking lot. "For what it is worth, your documentation made the review much easier. I learned to keep paperwork. Most expensive lessons usually teach that." Outside, the rain had stopped. Streetlights reflected across the wet pavement as I walked home. When I reached my driveway, drops still clung to the flagpole, shining beneath the porch light. I opened the mailbox and found no certified envelope, no violation notice, no demand for removal. Just a utility bill and a grocery advertisement. It felt strangely luxurious. I went inside, pulled out the folder I had built over the previous weeks, and began putting everything in chronological order. The contractor invoice, utility confirmation, fine statements, hearing notice, statute, Patricia's signed determination, the old council email, the rescission letter. Finally, I placed the original violation notice on top. The blue circle around that small sentence was still there, subject to applicable state and federal law. I remembered Patricia standing in my driveway telling me the rules were clear. She had been right about one thing. They were clear once somebody bothered to read all of them. I closed the folder and set it inside my desk drawer. Outside, a breeze moved through Brookfield Ridge, and the familiar sound reached me faintly through the window. Tap, tap, tap. The pole had never changed. The law had never changed. What changed was the board finally understanding that its authority had boundaries. By November, the flagpole had become so ordinary again that I sometimes walked past it without thinking about the weeks of certified letters, fines, hearings, and legal language it had brought into my life. One Saturday morning, I stepped outside with coffee while the neighborhood was still quiet. The air had that sharp late fall chill that makes every sound seem clearer. A school bus passed at the end of the street. Somewhere behind the houses, a leaf blower started. Above my lawn, the American flag opened in a steady breeze, and the halyard touched the aluminum pole. Tap, tap, tap. I stood there listening because that sound had followed the entire dispute. It had been there when Patricia photographed the pole. It had been there when she handed me the first notice. It had been there when the fines began accumulating, and when I came home after the board finally reduced my balance to zero. The sound had never changed. Only what it meant to me had changed. I went inside and opened my desk drawer. The folder was still exactly where I had left it. I pulled out the original violation notice and carried it back outside. The paper had softened along the folds from being handled so many times. Patricia's enforcement language occupied most of the page, but my eyes went immediately to the blue circle near the bottom. Subject to applicable state and federal law. Those words had been there before I called Rebecca, before the hearing, before Mark found the old legal email, and before Susan replaced Patricia as president. Brookfield Ridge had effectively printed the limit of its own authority on the same document it used to threaten me. All I had done was notice it. A few minutes later, Susan walked past with her dog and stopped at the edge of my driveway. She glanced toward the flag. "Everything still working properly? Has not moved an inch." She smiled. "That is probably the least surprising thing about this whole situation." Susan told me the revised enforcement procedures had already been used twice. In both cases, the board checked applicable law before issuing penalties. Neither dispute required a hearing. "It takes longer on the front end," she said, but apparently it saves everyone time afterward. I folded the old notice. Funny how that works. After she continued down the sidewalk, I stayed beside the pole for another minute. I never considered Patricia losing the presidency my victory. She lost that position because her own board decided leadership required more than confidence. My victory was simpler. My account was clear. My property rights had been respected. The flagpole remained where I had installed it, subject to reasonable rules rather than somebody's assumption of unlimited authority. I returned the notice to the folder, but kept the lesson. A board can send official letters. It can schedule hearings. It can issue fines when its governing documents and the law allow them. Those things can feel enormous when your name is printed at the top of the page. But authority has boundaries, and sometimes those boundaries are hiding in the smallest sentence on the document. That morning, I raised my coffee toward the flag, more amused than triumphant. The wind pulled the fabric outward, sunlight caught the aluminum, and the halyard sounded once more against the pole. Tap, tap, tap. Patricia had believed the strongest thing in our dispute was the board's rule. It turned out to be the line underneath it.